Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this London Luminaries talk, one of a series of 14 on the subject of food and drink. This talk is going to be focused around William Hogarth's Beer Street and Gin Lane works, and we're going to look at particularly the production of gin, but how and why alcohol was produced, how it was consumed, and how it was perceived through the 18th century. My focus today, Drunk for a Penny, how did we get to William Hogarth's Gin Lane, is particularly because I am the Historic Houses Senior Manager for the London Borough of Hounslow, which means that one of my responsibilities is looking after Hogarth's house, the artist's former home, and still open to the public as a museum today. So my focus is going to be around this work, Gin Lane. Gin Lane, certainly the most well-known and popular of the works of Hogarth for our visitors. It's the one most visitors know when they come to visit. And it's one in which Hogarth depicts society as kind of falling apart because of the apparent evils of drink. The scene depicts people from all stations of life being affected by the evils of gin and what it's done to society. And it shows the very fabric of society, not just the people, but the buildings falling down. Front and center at the top of the steps there is the much reproduced image of the woman whose baby is falling from her arms, the neglect caused by her interest in anything but looking after the child because of those societal decays. We're going to come back to the symbolism and some of the specifics that are available in that work later in the talk. But before we get there, I want to turn to how we ended up in the position of 1751 and William Hogarth producing this work. And to do that, we are going to go and have a look at the fact that Hogarth, this is the advert that Hogarth produced for the pair of Beer Street and Gin Lane. And what's to note here in particular is that the crisis that was perceived by gin was so great in 1751 that even Hogarth, who is, as well as an artist, a business person, he reduces the prices. These are the cheapest to buy prints that Hogarth produces. Unlike most of his works, they're not produced as paintings first. They go straight out, produced quickly as part of a campaign to improve society by restricting and limiting the production and sale of gin. So for Hogarth, this is serious enough to cut into his profits, as well as for him to depict the scenes that we'll be talking about through the course of this talk. We're going to talk firstly about William of Orange for the origins of how we get to Hogarth's 1751 work. Hogarth and many others present gin as the great social harm of that age. And gin consumption in Britain is most often and probably fairly linked to this man, William of Orange. William takes the throne of Britain. Excuse me. William takes the throne in the Glorious Revolution as a Protestant monarch, replacing the Catholic convert James II. And with him comes gin. And gin is a symbol of Protestantism. It's linked to William's origins in the continent and the fact that it becomes a symbol of his reign. But it's worth noting that Britain did have a drinking culture already. The companion piece to Hogarth's Gin Lane is this work, Beer Street, and where everything's falling apart in Gin Lane. In Beer Street, everybody is happy and healthy. The only falling apart building is the one of the pawnbroker who has no one to prey on and take advantage of. This, though, does show that beer had a place in society. Drinking was a part of British society that didn't come with the advent of the Protestant drink of gin. But gin was present in Britain at that time, just not produced in those large quantities. And what Beer Street echoes here is that beer was a particularly big part of British society. Everybody drank. Beer was the kind of main thing that everybody drank. Men, women, and children, children's young as 6, 7, and 8 would have small beer for breakfast. Now, partially that's because water wasn't so good, but it's more than just the only alternative being beer. It's that beer was seen as healthy. It was seen as something that would nurture your health and make you better. However, it's not just that beer is seen as a healthy and nutritious thing to have. There is also a culture of getting drunk in Britain for the sake of getting drunk. It's well recorded in multiple places. And when William of Orange does arrive in 1688, there's just a change in how and what alcohol is to be produced. So, for example, filling in with some of those political ambitions at the time, in 1690, French brandy was banned from import. There's a 1690 an act for the encouraging of distilling. It meant that there was no regulation. Effectively, regulation was wiped away. No license was needed to produce or to buy. And gin also comes in with the many Dutch sailors that come in and are particularly present in London. With them comes the culture of drinking gin. We get the idea of Dutch courage from this period and this practice of gin being present. And we also have this sort of Protestant drink feeling and something that's actually quite warming and has an effect more immediately than beer, for example, would do. But gin as well. Gin is seen as healthy. As late as 1736, gin's been sold as a medicine. Queen Anne was a great drinker and of gin, and it's seen in society as a drink that's not just Protestant and proper in for political and terms of the faithful, but also something that makes things bearable. It's both warming, reviving, and it starts to serve a purpose across society for a great many reasons. Those aren't just the effects that it has on those who consume it, but also the effects that it can have on the economy. This picture of the harvest also ties in with the idea that William's trying to improve British agriculture. Now, wheat's an absolutely vital staple for bread, but this is a period where the only way that agriculture works well is with crop rotation. And as we all know, of kind of fields being left fallow, but fields also need to be planted as part of that three-part crop rotation. And barley was most commonly used in that planting in between the wheat and the fallow. But it was not particularly useful once harvested. However, a supply of barley was created by this fallow crop rotation policy. And what that leads to is a lot of barley that's available to be distilled into spirits. The harvest isn't being encouraged this way to create the production of gin, but it does give a useful and profitable way for the barley to be harvested, sold, brought into the economy. And the better the practices in farming happens, the more secure the food supply is, and so the more secure the ruling classes are. If we go into the period where Hogarth produces his work, the London that Hogarth has known after the 60 years or so of gin being a bigger part of British society. In the 1730s, there were about 1,500 distillers in London. Only 100 of those or so are big stills. Most of them are produced in very small household quantities. By 1750, the City of London had over 1,000 gin shops, and that accounted for 1 in every 15 houses in London was selling gin. In Westminster, there were 2,200 places where you could buy gin. Holborn, for example, also had 1,350 recorded places to buy gin. And that amounts to 1 in 5 houses in Holborn at that time. One of the things, the perception of this is that the drink is often presented as extremely powerful. It's a spirit. It's not regulated. There's no proof available for drinks at this point. But it's when you look through the records at the time, people are complaining. The consumers of gin complain about the strength of gin, as in it's not strengthened. It's adulterated. It's weaker than it should be. The evils of gin often perceived to be that kind of super high strength of the gin, but it's more the ubiquity of the gin that seems to be the real issue within the society. If indeed, after you've heard everything we have to say here, you think that it is an issue. It's important to say how gin was drunk. So it would be ordered in quarter pints called quarterns, but they weren't necessarily, or really at all intended to be drunk by a single person. That was a measure that would be shared, and they were often adulterated with other things. Once the gin had been approved, it wasn't people drinking quarter pints, as people may drink a shot of neat alcohol today. It was being consumed in a much more familiar way of something that was shared and sort of taken in over longer periods. To Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister in 1729 until 1751, attempted multiple acts to control gin. Gin acts are passed through the 1720s and 30s. And it was a sign that society had started to sort of move against gin, see it as a harmful presence. The fact that by the time Hogarth produces Gin Lane, the movement is still seen as one which needs attention probably shows you the extent of the success or indeed the targeting of those acts. But what was for sure is that gin was, and its consumption, was seen as a particularly urban phenomenon. As people are drawn to the cities, gin is seen as that part of that corrupting influence. Hogarth's work in 1732, around the period of some of Walpole's first gin acts, depicts the story of a corrupted young woman drawn in to the city. And there's a whole other story around the harlot's progress, but it's emblematic of what's seen as happening, that the corrupting influence of urban life. And in the harlot, this is kind of expounded upon. But gin is also seen as part of this. It's seen as associated with crime. You can look at Old Bailey records that show lots of crime that's associated with gin. You see lots of crime that's associated with other alcohol and other things as well. But it's something that comes to the concern of people in society as reducing, for example, the productivity of workers. It's seen as contributing to the sickness of children. It's particularly targeted around mothers' consumptions of gin, which is seen as something which will cause deformities in babies, but also something that leads to the neglect of children. And there are particular stories at the time that become the sort of causes around which people rally to say that gin is this evil in society. A woman named Mary Eastwick, who, in a drunken stupor while looking after a child, is said to have, rather than put a log on the fire, to put the baby in her charge on the fire. Judith IV was executed in 1734 for her part in the murder of her own baby, a baby she'd taken to the workhouse, where the baby received new clothes. Her and her friend went to collect the baby to spend some time with the 2-year-old, and her friend strangled the baby to death, stole the clothes, which were then reportedly sold for the purchase of gin. There is another element here, which it's the higher classes are seeing that this is particularly the poor being corrupted, the social order being threatened, the drink itself perhaps being seen as a way that the poor are getting above themselves. That idea that it's connected with moving to the city. When I say getting above themselves, the process would be the moving to the city is the beginning of social mobility. It's the idea that you can change the circumstances you're in. You are not a fixed asset that society can rely on for harvests to be in a particular place, that the cities can draw people in for work, and that can be competitive. And that if gin is a symbol of that urban working class consumption, then it itself is a symbol of the working classes sort of damaging the social fabric that the ruling classes have benefited from for so long. So there are people, all these gin acts who are going, we hear a lot about the kind of campaigns to stop them, but there are multiple people who are against the reform, not least distillers who sold the vast majority of the spirits who were concerned domestically. There were farmers who wanted to protect their barley sales, which had become incredibly valuable. And it's reflected in the fact that the acts that, particularly through the 1730s and towards the 1750s, were really aimed at smaller distillers, to up the need to provide licenses and the costs that drove people really to dodge this legislation. It wasn't trying to end the trade completely. It was trying to eliminate the smaller suppliers so that the economic basis on which gin was produced could continue, that those barley sales could continue to be part of the economy, but rather that working people weren't in control of how these production, manufacture, and distribution of gin was controlled. You see the popular that popular feeling that the removal of gin from society and the availability of gin is a bad thing. This image by John Clarke in 1736, the funeral procession of Madame Geneva. Madame Geneva becomes the sort of personified version of gin. She's depicted in art as firing up soldiers and sailors, going back to that drunk, that Dutch courage we talked about earlier. But she's also seen as an agent of provenance. The idea that this is a Protestant drink being associated with Protestant things. She kind of becomes an alternative version of Britannia in a lot of ways. She's the rival to Britannia in a great ways. And when the Act to ban gin in 1736 comes in, funerals were actually held for Madame Geneva. When the 1738 acts aren't working, as the government can't enforce them and there are riots, the calls that go up as part of those riots are no gin, no king. This is a movement that is socially stratified, and the objections predominantly come from those in positions of power or perceived moral authority against those who are working and are in that urban setting in particular. We're going to move our story on now to Henry Fielding, perhaps most famous as the founder of the Bow Street Runners in 1749. He produced an inquiry into the causes of late increases in robbers. This was produced in 1751, and it talked about how the dregs of people had been transformed, the narrowness of their fortune is changed into wealth, the simplicity of their manners into craft, their frugality into luxury, their humility into pride, and their subjugation into equality. Really voicing that idea that it's not so much the gin as the circumstances in which the gin are produced, and this growing sense of social mobility, which will change society. High wages were a part of this as well. You could see that plays, for example, were better attended, and ironically, some plays in which Fielding had written himself. People had income to spend on these things, and we are in a period of pleasure gardens and masquerades, and gin, drinking, gambling are all seen as things which are linked to crime, for a kind of moral decay and bankruptcy. But there are also things that people do as part of entertainment when they have an income on which to spend things. Fielding's perspective is basically that the mob needs to be brought to heel and become a more disciplined and relied upon labour force. He talks about throwing the reins on the neck of idleness. Again, the idea that alcohol was contributing to a lack of productivity. If we go back to Beer Street and Gin Lane, which were issued as a pair together, and just look a little bit more detail about what we're looking at across the two pieces, you look at Gin Lane, the Parish of St Giles being the venue for this. And if you look across all of what we see in this image to the right, as you look at the screen, you see a gin cellar in the streets. You see a distiller who is aptly named as Kilman. You see the woman in the foreground who is dropping the baby. It's worth noting a few things here, that she seems to be consuming snuff actually rather than gin. Although gin is everywhere. You see the only building which stands upright is that of the pawnbrokers. And that idea of moral decay, you have a craftsman trading in his tools, presumably to buy gin. You have a woman trading in her cooking pots. Again, the idea that the fabric of society is being damaged. If you look over to the sort of center right of the image, you see two young girls who are sort of the wards of the parish. You can tell by their outfits with the in the very centre with the hoods and the hats. Uh, they're drinking gin. Again, it's seen as a sort of corrupting influence. If you look at the gin cellar in the very left of the bottom left of the image, there's an inscription there: "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing." Um, Taken usually to mean the sort of despair of the situation, although some do, and it could be argued that the clean straw actually speaks to the idea that a drinking establishment was somewhere people could go together. I'll leave you to decide if it is a clean and safer place than home, but more traditionally taken to show the despair that gin would bring. You see above below the woman in the center on the steps, a former soldier who's pawned most of his clothes to buy the gin that sits in his basket, next to a pamphlet that is denouncing gin, showing the lack of effect that the campaigns have had so far. We've talked about the two girls of the wards of the parish of St Giles. You can see the badges on their arms. They've each got a glass of gin. And you can basically see that society is in despair because of the fact that gin has pervaded so much. So buildings fall apart. You see a man in the top right corner through the window of the broken down building who has hung himself for the ruin of his business. You see the burial happening in the very center of the picture, and everywhere the negative effect of gin can be seen. Beer Street, but is the contrasting position, as we've already hinted at. There's food, there's plenty. People are clearly very well fed in the foreground. As we said, it's only the pawnbrokers who is not together. But there's still a couple of interesting points being here. While the buildings are all good repair, you can still see beer being served through a hatch in the wall. You can see the artist who's painting the sign there. There's actually a gin bottle on the sign, and in some images of this, some versions of this image, on the artist's hip, what looks like a gin bottle. So there's more complex comment than the additional one that could be read into it if you were so minded. What happens next is the 1752 Act. So Hogarth is part of the setup with Fielding. He's working with Fielding. And the 1752 gin acts come in. And it's after that that things seem to change with gin. The act goes after some of the bigger suppliers. And what it has the effect effectively of doing is it brings gin into licensed premises. It brings them into the places where other alcohol is consumed on top of that as well. And you get to see that there is more going on than just, excuse me, there is more going on than just what's happening with the acts. We've already talked about the snuff box, but there's also, through the 1750s, much poorer harvest. The economy suffers, and there's a sort of increased poverty. With increased poverty, particularly in the cities, comes a lower disposable income. So if you see gin as part of a wider drinking culture, rather than a problem that is one of kind of addiction and people who can't help themselves, that change in economic circumstances, particularly the poor harvests that reduce the raw material, could be seen as a contributing factor as much as that 1752 Act. Why was it special? And also there's a factor of competition as well. There's what's cheaper. Beer and porter certainly become cheaper and are cheaper, but tea is also much more affordable by that period as well. So the economic conditions in which people were looking for things to spend their money on and to draw their attention also change, as well as the act. And although you have scares, the sort of moral panic and the period known as the gin craze declines from this point and doesn't really recover the same levels of the sort of 60 years of panic that have come and gin sort of becomes a much smaller part of society and much less consumed. It all ties in to those dates for the production of Hogarth's work and that campaign that leads to the 1752 Acts. But you can decide for yourselves on the information you've heard as to which you think was more prominent, yet another gin act and these pieces of art, or society itself moving on and away from gin because of other things. That's it for today's talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. If you're interested in knowing more about Hogarth's House and our public programmes, you can go to hogarthshouse.org. We have a large collection of Hogarth first edition prints on display, work done by the artist's own hand, and you can see the place where he and his family lived in the later years. This, of course, was part of a series of talks, so do look on the YouTube channel for London Luminaries to see some of the great other talks on this theme and all the other talks that the London Luminaries have produced through different years and different seasons. But that's all from me. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed today's talk.